Billionaire CEO accidentally walked into his own bathroom, saw his maid, and the unexpected ending. Get ready for a story that will tug at your heartstrings, challenge your perspective, and remind you that even in the darkest moments, love and compassion can light the way. This isn't just a tale of romance. It's a story of transformation, hope, and the courage to rewrite your destiny. Ethan Carter was a man who had everything, or so it seemed. As the CEO of Carter Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, he was known for his sharp mind, ruthless business tactics, and an unshakable demeanor. His towering glass mansion, perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the city, was a symbol of his success. Yet, behind the cold steel and glass walls, Ethan lived a life of solitude. His days were consumed by endless meetings, high-stakes deals, and the constant pressure to maintain his empire. Love, family, and connection were luxuries he neither sought nor believed in. It was a quiet evening when Ethan returned home after a grueling day at work. The house was eerily silent, as always, save for the faint hum of the automated systems that controlled every aspect of his life. He loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and headed upstairs to his private quarters. The weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders, and all he wanted was a hot shower to wash away the stress. As he pushed open the door to his bathroom, he froze. Standing there, under the soft glow of the bathroom lights, was a young woman. Her back was turned to him, and she was clearly startled by the sound of the door. She spun around, her wide brown eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension, and Ethan's mind raced to make sense of the situation. The woman was dressed in a simple uniform, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She looked out of place in the luxurious surroundings, her presence a stark contrast to the pristine marble and gold fixtures of the bathroom. It was clear she wasn't supposed to be there. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "The staff bathroom downstairs is out of order, and I didn't think anyone would be home this early. I'll leave right away." Ethan's initial reaction was anger. How dare someone invade his private space? But as he looked at her, he noticed the fear in her eyes and the way her hands trembled as she clutched a towel to her chest. She wasn't a threat. She was terrified. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cold but controlled. "I'm Sophia Bennett," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm one of the housekeepers. I just started last week." Ethan studied her for a moment. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with a delicate face that bore the signs of exhaustion. There was a quiet strength about her, though, something that intrigued him despite himself. "You shouldn't be in here," he said finally, his tone softening slightly. "This is my private space." "I know," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to intrude. It won't happen again." She moved to leave, but Ethan stepped aside, allowing her to pass. As she brushed past him, he caught a faint whiff of lavender, simple, unpretentious, and oddly comforting. He watched as she disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Ethan stood there for a moment, staring at the empty doorway. Something about the encounter unsettled him. He had met countless people in his life, powerful executives, ambitious socialites, and even the occasional gold digger, but none of them had ever looked at him the way Sophia had. There was no awe, no flattery, no attempt to impress him. Instead, her gaze had been filled with a mixture of fear, defiance, and something else he couldn't quite place. Shaking his head, Ethan dismissed the thought and stepped into the shower. The hot water cascaded over him, but it did little to ease the tension in his chest. He told himself it was just a minor incident, nothing worth dwelling on. Yet, as he lay in bed that night, the image of Sophia's wide, frightened eyes lingered in his mind. Meanwhile, downstairs, Sophia sat on the edge of her small cot in the staff quarters, her heart still racing from the encounter. She had heard stories about Ethan Carter, the cold, calculating billionaire who ruled his empire with an iron fist. She had expected him to yell at her, to fire her on the spot, but instead, He had let her go without much of a reprimand. It was strange, almost unsettling. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than the ruthless businessman everyone described. Sophia sighed and buried her face in her hands. She didn't have time to dwell on Ethan Carter or his unexpected kindness. Her life was already complicated enough. Between working long hours to support her sick mother and younger brother, she barely had a moment to breathe. This job was her lifeline, and she couldn't afford to lose it, not for any reason. Little did she know, the brief encounter in the bathroom was only the beginning. Their lives, so vastly different yet inexplicably intertwined, were about to collide in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The days following their unexpected encounter were uneventful on the surface, but beneath the calm exterior of Ethan Carter's life, something had shifted. He found himself thinking about Sophia Bennett more often than he cared to admit. Her presence lingered in his mind like a faint echo, disrupting the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. He told himself it was nothing, just a passing curiosity about someone so different from the people he usually encountered. Yet the more he tried to push her out of his thoughts, the more she seemed to occupy them. Sophia, on the other hand, did her best to avoid Ethan altogether. She stuck to her duties, keeping her head down and staying out of his way. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself. Her job at the Carter estate was her only source of income, and she couldn't afford to lose it. Her mother's medical bills were piling up, and her younger brother Liam was still in school. Every dollar she earned went toward keeping her family afloat. But fate had other plans. One evening, Ethan returned home earlier than usual. He was restless, his mind clouded with thoughts of work and the growing unease he couldn't quite place. As he walked through the house, he heard faint music coming from the kitchen. Curious, he followed the sound and found Sophia standing by the sink, humming softly as she washed dishes. She didn't notice him at first, and for a moment, he simply watched her. There was something calming about the way she moved, her presence a stark contrast to the chaos of his world. When she finally turned and saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Carter," she said, quickly drying her hands. "I didn't hear you come in." Ethan waved off her formality. "It's fine. I didn't mean to startle you." There was an awkward pause before he spoke again. "You're always here late. Don't you ever take a break?" Sophia hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I don't mind," she said finally. "It's better to stay busy." Ethan frowned, sensing there was more to her answer than she was letting on, but before he could press further, his phone buzzed, pulling him back into the demands of his world. He left the kitchen, but the brief interaction only deepened his curiosity about her. A few days later, Ethan's curiosity got the better of him. He asked his assistant to pull up a background check on Sophia. It wasn't something he did often, but he needed to understand why she seemed so different from everyone else. What he found left him speechless. Sophia Bennett was the daughter of James Bennett, a man whose name Ethan hadn't heard in years, but whose story was etched into the darker chapters of his family's history. Years ago, James had owned a small but thriving construction company. He was well respected in his community, known for his honesty and hard work. But when Carter Enterprises, under the leadership of Ethan's father, Richard Carter, decided to expand into the same market, James's company became collateral damage. Through a series of aggressive business tactics, hostile takeovers, undercutting contracts, and leveraging political connections, Richard Carter had driven James Bennett's company into bankruptcy. The fallout was devastating. James lost everything: his business, his home, and eventually his health. The stress and humiliation took a toll on him, leaving his family to pick up the pieces. Ethan stared at the report, his chest tightening with guilt. He had always known his father's methods were ruthless, but seeing the direct impact on someone like Sophia made it impossible to ignore. She had been just a child when her family's life was turned upside down, and now, years later, she was working as a housekeeper in the very home of the man whose family had caused her pain. The weight of the revelation was almost too much to bear. Ethan felt a surge of anger toward his father, but also toward himself. He had spent years turning a blind eye to the consequences of his family's actions, convincing himself that business was just business. But now, faced with the reality of Sophia's struggles, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. That evening, Ethan found himself wandering through the house, his thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. He ended up in the staff quarters, where he saw Sophia sitting at a small table, sorting through a stack of bills. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped under the weight of her responsibilities. "Do you ever stop working?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Sophia looked up, startled. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, a hint of a smile on her lips. Ethan hesitated before stepping closer. "Sophia, can I ask you something?" She nodded cautiously. "Why do you work so hard? I mean, you're young. You should be out enjoying life, not spending all your time here." Sophia's expression hardened slightly. "Not everyone has the luxury of enjoying life, Mr. Carter. Some of us have responsibilities we can't ignore." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to say something, to apologize for what his family had done to hers, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. Instead, he simply nodded and left, the weight of her words following him like a shadow. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything he had learned about Sophia and her family. For the first time in years, he felt truly powerless. He had spent his entire life building an empire, but what good was it if it had been built on the suffering of others? Sophia, meanwhile, had no idea about the storm brewing inside Ethan. To her, he was still just her boss, a man she tried to avoid as much as possible, but deep down, she couldn't deny that there was something different about him. He wasn't the cold, unfeeling billionaire she had expected. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a hint of something human beneath the surface. Little did she know, their lives were about to become even more intertwined, as the secrets of the past began to unravel and force them both to confront the truth. Ethan Carter had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize. Business was business, and emotions had no place in his world. But ever since he learned the truth about Sophia Bennett and her family, he found it impossible to focus. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the damage his family had caused. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt the weight of his privilege and the consequences of his father's ruthless ambition. Sophia, on the other hand, continued to go about her work, unaware of the turmoil she had stirred in Ethan. She remained polite but distant, keeping their interactions strictly professional. Yet, Ethan couldn't help but notice the small details about her, the way she hummed softly while cleaning, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about her younger brother Liam, or the quiet determination in her every action. One evening, as Ethan sat in his study, staring blankly at a stack of reports, he made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to make things right. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he had to do something. The next day, Ethan approached Sophia in the kitchen. She was preparing a tray of tea for the staff, her movements quick and efficient. When she saw him, she froze, unsure of what to expect. "Do you have a moment?" Ethan asked, his tone softer than usual. Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. Mr. Carter?" Ethan gestured toward the dining table. "Sit with me for a minute." Reluctantly, Sophia set the tray down and took a seat across from him. She folded her hands in her lap, her posture stiff. "I wanted to ask about your family," Ethan began, his voice careful. "You mentioned your brother the other day. How is he doing?" Sophia blinked, surprised by the question. "Liam? He's doing well, I suppose. He's in his final year of high school. He wants to go to college, but—" She trailed off, her expression clouding. "But what?" Ethan pressed gently. Sophia sighed. "It's expensive. Between my mother's medical bills and everything else, I'm not sure how we'll manage it. But I'll figure something out. I always do." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He wanted to tell her that he knew about her family's past, that he understood the burden she carried, but he couldn't bring himself to say the words. Instead, he nodded. "You're strong, Sophia. I admire that." Sophia looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you asking me this, Mr. Carter? You've never shown much interest in the staff before?" Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "I suppose I've been reevaluating some things," he admitted. "I've spent so much time focused on work that I've forgotten what really matters." Sophia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stood. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Ethan watched her leave, frustration bubbling inside him. He wanted to break through the walls she had built around herself, but he didn't know how. Over the next few weeks, Ethan began to make small changes. He started spending more time at home, observing the staff and learning about their lives. He quietly arranged for the staff bathroom to be renovated, ensuring that Sophia and the others had a comfortable space to use. He also began anonymously paying off some of Sophia's family's debts, starting with her mother's medical bills. Sophia noticed the changes, but didn't know what to make of them. Ethan seemed different, less cold, more approachable. He even started joining the staff for meals occasionally, something he had never done before. One evening, as Sophia was leaving the estate, she found Ethan waiting by the front door. "Do you need a ride home?" he asked, his voice casual. Sophia frowned. "I usually take the bus, it's fine." "It's late," Ethan said. "Let me drive you." Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "All right, thank you." The drive was quiet at first, the tension between them palpable, but as they neared her neighborhood, Ethan broke the silence. "Tell me about your brother," he said. "What does he want to study?" Sophia glanced at him, surprised by the question. "He wants to be an engineer. He's always been good with numbers and building things. He's smart, smarter than I ever was." Ethan smiled faintly. "You're smart too, Sophia. Don't sell yourself short." Sophia looked away, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you," she said softly. When they reached her house, Ethan parked the car and turned to her. "If there's ever anything you need, Sophia, don't hesitate to ask. I mean it." Sophia nodded, her heart pounding. "Good night, Mr. Carter." "Good night, Sophia." As the days turned into weeks, the connection between Ethan and Sophia deepened. They began to share more moments together. Quiet conversations in the kitchen, shared laughter over small jokes, and even a few stolen glances that neither of them could ignore. For Ethan, Sophia was a breath of fresh air in a world that had always felt suffocating. She reminded him of what it meant to care, to feel, to be human. For Sophia, Ethan was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. He was still the powerful CEO she worked for, but there was a kindness in him now, a vulnerability that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Ethan turned to Sophia. "You've changed me, you know," he said quietly. Sophia looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" "I've spent my whole life chasing success, thinking it would make me happy. But it didn't. You've shown me that there's more to life than money and power. You've shown me what it means to care about something, someone." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Little did they know, their growing connection was about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. The secrets of the past were still lurking in the shadows, waiting to come to light. Ethan Carter had always known that his father, Richard Carter, was a ruthless businessman. Growing up, he had watched Richard dominate boardrooms, crush competitors, and build Carter Enterprises into a global empire. Ethan had admired his father's strength and determination, but as he grew older, he began to see the cracks in the foundation of that success. Now, with the truth about Sophia Bennett's family weighing heavily on his conscience, Ethan could no longer ignore the darker side of his family's legacy. The tension between Ethan and his father had been building for weeks. Richard had noticed the changes in his son, the way Ethan spent more time at home, the way he seemed distracted during meetings, and, most of all, the way he had started questioning the company's practices. Richard didn't like it. To him, Ethan's newfound softness was a sign of weakness, and weakness had no place in the Carter family. One evening, as Ethan sat in his study, reviewing old company records, Richard stormed in unannounced. His presence filled the room like a thundercloud, and Ethan braced himself for the inevitable confrontation. "What the hell is going on with you, Ethan?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. "You've been distracted, unfocused. You're letting emotions cloud your judgment, and it's affecting the company." Ethan closed the file he was reading and looked up at his father. "I've been thinking about the way we do business," he said evenly. "About the people we've hurt along the way." Richard scoffed. "Hurt? This is business, Ethan. It's not personal. If you want to succeed, you can't let yourself get bogged down by sentimentality." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's not just sentimentality, Dad. It's about doing what's right. Do you even realize the damage we've caused? The lives we've destroyed?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Ethan stood, his voice rising. "I'm talking about James Bennett, about his family, about how you destroyed his company and left them with nothing. His daughter, Sophia, works here now. She's one of our housekeepers. Do you even care what we did to them?" Richard's expression darkened. James Bennett was weak. He couldn't compete, so he lost. That's how the world works, Ethan. If you're not strong enough to survive, you don't deserve to. Ethan shook his head, his anger boiling over. "That's not strength, Dad. That's cruelty. And I won't be a part of it anymore." Richard stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "You're my son, Ethan. You're the heir to this company. Everything I've built, I built for you. Don't throw it all away over some girl." Ethan's eyes flashed with defiance. "This isn't about her. It's about us. About the kind of people we've become. I don't want to be like you, Dad. I don't want to build my success on the suffering of others." For a moment the room was silent, the tension between father and son crackling like electricity. Then Richard spoke, his voice cold and final. "If you walk away from this, you're no longer my son. You'll lose everything, your position, your inheritance, your name. Is that what you want?" Ethan met his father's gaze, his resolve unshaken. "If that's the price I have to pay to do what's right, then so be it." The confrontation with his father left Ethan shaken but resolute. He knew he couldn't continue to be a part of Carter Enterprises, not as long as it operated under Richard's ruthless philosophy. The next morning, Ethan called an emergency board meeting. The room was filled with the company's top executives, all of whom looked to Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I've called this meeting to announce my resignation as CEO of Carter Enterprises," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the murmurs of shock that rippled through the room. "Effective immediately, I will be stepping down and severing all ties with the company." One of the board members, a longtime ally of Richard, spoke up. "Ethan, this is highly irregular. What's the meaning of this?" Ethan took a deep breath. "For years, this company has operated on principles that I can no longer support. We've prioritized profit over people, and in doing so, we've caused irreparable harm to countless lives. I can't be a part of that anymore." The room erupted into chaos, with voices overlapping as the board members tried to make sense of Ethan's decision. But Ethan remained calm, his mind made up. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to his father's expectations, but now he realized that true strength came from standing up for what he believed in. Later that evening, Ethan found Sophia in the garden, tending to the flowers. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice cautious, "is everything all right?" Ethan hesitated, then sat down on the bench beside her. "I resigned today," he said simply. Sophia's eyes widened in surprise. "You? Resigned? Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. Because I couldn't keep living a lie. I couldn't keep pretending that the way my family does business is okay, and because I wanted to make things right. Sophia frowned, confused. What do you mean? And took a deep breath. I know about your father, Sophia. I know what my family did to him, to your family, and I'm sorry. I can't change the past, but I want to do everything I can to make up for it. Sophia stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of shock, anger, and something she couldn't quite name. You knew? She whispered. All this time you knew? Ethan nodded. I found out a few weeks ago. I didn't know how to tell you, but I couldn't keep it from you any longer. Sophia stood, her hands trembling. Do you think an apology is enough? Do you think you can just fix everything with money and good intentions? Ethan stood as well, his voice earnest. I don't expect you to forgive me, Sophia. I just want you to know that I'm trying. I've started a foundation to help families like yours, to support small businesses and provide resources for people who've been hurt by companies like mine. It's not enough, but it's a start. Sophia looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. Why are you doing this? Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft. Because of you. You've shown me what it means to care, to fight for something bigger than myself. You've changed me, Sophia, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then slowly, Sophia reached out and took his hand. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said quietly, but I believe you, and I believe you're trying. Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with hope. That's all I can ask for. The days following Ethan's resignation were a whirlwind of change. News of his decision spread quickly, making headlines across the business world. Ethan Carter steps down as CEO of Carter Enterprises was splashed across every major publication, accompanied by speculation about his reasons. Some called it a bold move, others labeled it reckless, but Ethan didn't care. For the first time in his life, he felt free. Free from the weight of his father's expectations, free from the toxic legacy of Carter Enterprises, and free to chart his own path. Sophia, however, remained cautious. While she appreciated Ethan's efforts to make amends, she couldn't ignore the years of pain her family had endured because of his father's actions. Forgiveness wasn't something she could give easily, but she couldn't deny that Ethan's sincerity had begun to chip away at the walls she had built around her heart. One afternoon, Ethan invited Sophia to meet him at a small cafe in the city. It was a modest place, far removed from the opulence of the Carter estate, and Sophia was surprised by how relaxed Ethan seemed as he sat at a corner table, sipping a cup of coffee. Thanks for coming, he said as she approached. Sophia sat down across from him, her expression guarded. What's this about? Ethan smiled faintly. I wanted to show you something. He slid a folder across the table. Sophia hesitated before opening it, her eyes scanning the documents inside. It was a proposal for a new foundation, the Bennett Initiative. It's named after your family, Ethan explained. The foundation will provide grants and resources to small businesses, especially those that have been affected by corporate greed. It'll also offer scholarships for students like your brother Liam, who want to pursue higher education, but don't have the means. Sophia looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You're serious about this? Ethan nodded. I am. I've already started the process of funding it with my own money. This isn't about redemption or trying to erase the past. It's about creating something better for the future. Sophia's hands trembled as she closed the folder. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Ethan said gently. I just wanted you to know that I'm committed to this, to making things right, not just for you, but for everyone who's been hurt by people like my father. For the first time, Sophia felt a glimmer of hope. She had spent so many years carrying the weight of her family's struggles, and now, for the first time, it felt like someone was lifting that burden, even if only a little. Over the next few months, Ethan threw himself into building the Bennett Initiative. He worked tirelessly, meeting with community leaders, small business owners, and families who had been affected by corporate exploitation. He listened to their stories, their struggles, and their dreams, and he used their input to shape the foundation's mission. Sophia watched from the sidelines, her skepticism slowly giving way to admiration. Ethan wasn't just talking about change. He was living it. He sold his shares in Carter Enterprises, using the proceeds to fund the foundation, and moved out of the sprawling mansion he had once called home. He rented a modest apartment in the city, closer to the people he was trying to help. One evening, as Sophia was leaving the estate after her shift, she found Ethan waiting for her by the gate. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Sophia nodded, curious. Ethan gestured toward a nearby park. "Walk with me?" They strolled in silence for a while, the cool evening air wrapping around them. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how an apology isn't enough." Sophia glanced at him, her expression softening. And you're right," Ethan admitted. "I can't undo the past, but I can try to build something better, not just for you, but for myself. I want to be someone you can trust, someone you can believe in." Sophia stopped walking, turning to face him. "You've already done so much, Ethan, more than I ever expected. But trust, that takes time." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm willing to wait, for as long as it takes." Sophia smiled faintly, her heart softening. "You're not the man I thought you were when I first met you. And you're not just a housekeeper," Ethan said, his voice filled with warmth. "You're the strongest, most compassionate person I've ever met. You've changed me, Sophia, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of you." As the months turned into years, the Bennett Initiative grew into a powerful force for good. Small businesses that had once been on the brink of collapse found new life. Students like Liam Bennett were able to pursue their dreams, and families who had been left behind by the system finally had a chance to rebuild. Ethan and Sophia's relationship also evolved. What had started as a fragile connection built on guilt and redemption blossomed into something deeper. They learned to trust each other, to support each other, and to build a life together that was rooted in compassion and understanding. One sunny afternoon, as they stood on the steps of the Foundation's new headquarters, Ethan turned to Sophia. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Sophia smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "We have, and there's still so much more to do." Ethan took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "We'll do it together." As they looked out at the crowd gathered to celebrate the Foundation's grand opening, Ethan felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He had spent his entire life chasing success, but now he understood that true fulfillment came not from wealth or power, but from the connections he had built and the lives he had touched. For Sophia, the journey had been one of healing and growth. She had learned to let go of the anger and pain that had defined her for so long, and in doing so, she had found a partner who shared her values and her vision for a better world. Together, they had turned a legacy of greed and destruction into one of hope and compassion. And as they stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew that their story was only just beginning.